Are we live?
I'm going to start right now.
We're live.
Yes, in just a couple of minutes. Okay. All right, so please, I am going to ask, and ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask all of you guys, you have wires and nails and magnets and all that stuff on your tables. I'm going to ask you to put them back over in the back table, because these are my Stellar Girl supplies, so I want to make sure I get them back. And then we're going to start here in just a couple of minutes. And I'm going to give you new things to pick up. Okay, and we're going to be doing electroscopes and batteries. So if you want to find those.
Yep, electroscope and battery in your binder.
So mine, I can look back. I just sent them. Yeah, and then I went on it and said administrative block. And I had to find. I don't know where they went. It was that one. Alright, so let me see. So I wasn't doing that. And I don't need them for a little while.
And I think even all my lessons like that when I did last year and all the tests and everything, they're on the old one, but every time I go through it, and I had a problem with all my documents, like for my track team, my country team, everything's like.
So what's the?
It worked. I had to change it like in the middle of the national board, and somehow it got blocked midway with my cohort, and I could not get any of the documents. No, it's not your fault.
So this one's not.
No, it will not let me.
I'll just leave it on there. Okay. But you're in here.
All right. Yes. We have everybody down in the room.
I know it's crazy how we're all, they have so much stuff.
Okay, so that's now, I'm getting things there for some reason. I don't know if it's because he said something to me about I should not be using that school district.
We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes.
Unfortunately.
Okay, we were talking, well, we're still waiting for people to come in. We were talking back here just a little bit about the fact that many of us feel uncomfortable with the fueling. It's a lot of directions, and if you're unfamiliar with electricity and multimeters and generators and motors and all of that, it's extremely intimidating. And so this is part of the reason why and girls feel uncomfortable with it as well, because it's not something that most of them have grown up doing. I think that that's changing a little bit, but it's still not something that most of them feel comfortable with. So all four of these activities they all kind of spiral off of one another, so you're gonna see some repeat in things, because we meet weekly, and we need to recap so that we know what's going on. So that's part of the reason why the PowerPoint or the Google Slides do what they do. So this particular section is about measuring and storing electricity. And they've learned a little bit about static electricity from the lesson that we just finished. So because they already know something, Carol and I, when we do this, we try as much as possible to get them to generate stuff that they know if it's not a disconnected one. So on your PowerPoint slide, there's a graphic here. I put it in graphic form. We haven't done it in graphic form before, but we have talked about what do we know about this? Where do we find electricity? How does that happen? How did we measure it? How do we measure it? So that the girls can kind of generate what they know. And that takes a little bit of time. If you have had your program for a little while, you probably have girls who are pretty comfortable with you and are not afraid to just yell out what they know. So it usually takes us a little while to go through it and generate it. Now, this is a little bit of a backtrack going that we do with our girls. Some of our girls have not had this before. Some of them have had this before, but we talk about this, and I want to make sure that you guys are comfortable with it as well. So, the smallest piece of matter is basically an atom, and it's got 3 parts. Most of our girls can generate that it's a proton, neutron, and electron, although that's new information for some of our girls, and we'll draw it. Sometimes we've actually gone as far as modeling it, where they we have little construction paper pieces and they glue it into their notebooks and something like that. But we talk about the charges on each of the particles, and we add one piece of information that they may or may not have had before, and that is that the outside of the atom has something called a valence electron. And not everybody calls it a valence electron. It depends on how people were taught, but the valence electron is on the outside, and it's out on that outer electron shell. There's a point of where it's either full or it's partially full or possibly even empty. And an electron on the outside, if you remember from what we talked about in the last one, they're either going to hold the electrons tightly, or the electrons are going to come off very easily. And it turns out that it becomes easy to remove an electron if an electron is in this valence shell by itself, or close to by itself, like 1 or 2 of them there, because there's a lack of balance there. And so it's easy to rub those off. Now, metals generally are what we call conductors. They carry electricity, and the reason they can do that is because they have loose electrons. So if you look on here, I would ask them, how many electrons do you see? Because this is copper, and copper is a metal, and metals generally carry electricity super easily. And so if we look at this, which electron has the least attraction to the nucleus? Which one is the least attracted?
The one on the outside.
Yeah, the one on the outside. The positive charge is all on here. And as you guys may have noticed doing your electromagnet, the further away you are from the thing that you're trying to attract, the less of a pull it has. So since this has got quite a distance away from the nucleus, there is less pull here, which is going to make it looser. So it is going to want to come off. So the question is, what is going to happen when it leaves? Where does that electron go? And I would ask them to generate where they think it goes, but it turns out, again, not the right slide. Turns out that it tends to jump to other valence shells on the outside. So if it leaves the one that was on, it's going to tend to make a jump to another shell. And if that is in a metal, it's just going to create a current. Now we also know that, because we tested it in the last lesson, that positive and negative attract one another, but if we have a negative end of a battery or of a magnet and another negative end, and we try and put them together, what happens? Yeah, it pushes apart. And if you guys did that in the lesson, they will know that. If you take the north end and the north end and try and put them together, they're gonna push apart. And the same thing if you put the south end to the south end. So that flow that we see here, this is electricity. Okay, whether it's static electricity or some other form of electricity, it's electricity. Now, people have always been fascinated by two electricity forms that they come in contact all the time. One is static electricity, and one is lightning. And static electricity, we already looked at. This is what happens when your hair kind of sticks out, when you take off your sweater, or you walk across a rug, your hair stands on end, or some materials will actually deliver a shock, okay? And we talked about that, so they usually have quite a bit to say in order, stories, oh, this happened to me, blah, blah, blah. They'll talk about that. And yes, or when we did this the last time, right, we talked about if you rub something on a balloon, you're rubbing off those electrons and it's gonna leave a charge. So keeping that in mind, we're gonna take a jump here and we're gonna talk about what happens with lightning. And in 1752, Benjamin Franklin conducted an experiment where he flew a kite and had a key attached to it. But what they don't tell you in the story is that there was actually a string, because he used a silk thread, which is a conductor, that went down into a little voltaic cell. And he was actually not trying to see if the electricity went to the key. He was actually trying to see if he could get the electricity to go into the jar and to see if it could be stored. That's really what his experiment was about. He actually did this, created what is the first documented lightning rod, and it led that electricity right into what they call a Leyden jar, which is a very simple battery. And it got stored in the jar. So as soon as he did this and his information went out, people started experimenting with this a ton, doing all kinds of crazy things. This is one of the experiments actually that he did. He has this metal ball that, if you can see there, they've got a piece of silk. They're rolling the ball. He's suspended from the ceiling, so he can't touch anything. His feet are on the ball to send electricity down his body and to see if they could ignite, cause a spark to happen on the other end. They were doing all kinds of crazy stuff to see what electricity was actually doing because they did not understand it. His experiment over here basically made a connection between static and lightning. Now, do you need to go into all of this with your students? No, you can do whatever you like in terms of doing it, but that Leyden jar is actually really important because it actually was a storage. Now, we can measure, this little picture right here is how they actually could tell if electricity was present, because you can't see on the surface of something if it actually is carrying a static charge, if there's a charge imbalance. So there are things that help us to see whether or not that is actually present. Now, this experiment has two parts. One part of it is making an electroscope to detect static electricity, and the other is to make a battery. There are two different kinds of electroscopes, and you could, if you wanted to, make both of them, but the lesson actually only has you make the pith ball. But this is a simple, what they call leaf electroscope. This is just a bell jar. It has to have a piece on here that is non-conductive, so I used cardboard, and it has to have conductive wire. Now, the thing about the conductive wire, copper works really, really well. It is super conductive, but when you buy copper wire, copper wire comes with an insulated coating. So you could buy this stuff and start setting it up, and nothing is going to happen. You're going to see absolutely nothing because there's a coating on the wire. So anytime that you do this, you have sandpaper available, a fine sandpaper, and then if you scrape the wire, you'll take the coating off, you'll expose the copper, and then it will work. If you create a charge, like I'm going to here, fur, right? And I know it's probably politically incorrect, but we have all kinds of pelts, and this is rubber. Yeah. And these are things that you can use or borrow. You can also do this with a balloon, right? The same way that you guys did. But as soon as you put the charge on there, oops, I just discharged it. There are 2 pieces of foil in there, and when you bring that close, you can see that the 2 foil pieces start to separate away. And I don't know if you want to come and take a look at it, because I know you can't see it from the front, and I only made one of these. But if you want to come to the front, I've got a couple of pelts and some of the rubber, I don't know, stick, call it a stick. If you want to come and just try it out, I'll give you just a couple of minutes to try it out so that you can see. Come on up, try it out. I've got 3 of these, and that way you can just kind of see how it goes. Well, you don't want to touch it. You don't want to touch it. See it right there? They're gonna fall apart.
Oni.
Yeah, so.
It works for me now. Here you go. Because it's building up charge on there. Kind of like yeah. Because otherwise they'll lay flat against each other.
Oh, I can touch it.
I feel like I'm really far away and I just keep hitting it.
Every time you do it, it builds up more charge. Unless we discharge it, and we would discharge it by touching it with our hands, and then it's going to discharge off onto your body. All right.
We got it pushed apart already.
Yeah, and actually, let's see if we can discharge. There we go. Okay.
Oh, no.
So try it again.
So each
Yeah.
one is
I'm watching. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's
long enough.
well, it's starting to. I can see it coming
Yeah.
out here. It takes a little while till it builds up enough charge.
It's not like a huge change where it like flies apart.
But it did when you hit this.
Well,
Well,
it's because it was completely discharged, and I think I don't know. Sometimes like the stars are aligned, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. All right, so we'll try. We'll finish this up because we're gonna make our. I tried to get it before.
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
And they just kind of go apart.
Like I started there.
Sometimes it'll jump.
Oh, wow.
When they both were sick.
All right, so let's.
Oh, that's
What's her name? I think.
Oh, did you hear it?
Yeah. Yeah. I said, there you go. No, the brown ones.
Okay. So.
So I just really quick wanted to draw your attention to something that we saw that was really great systems thinking stuff. I think right here is where we see a great thinking in levels example, where you see a single atom and then you see a system of atoms and how they work and how they're interconnected, how they interact, how electrons can flow through that system once you have more of them, and how they're doing it. Then we talk about bigger scale and connect it to something that we already did. But then you get to see, like on a macro level right here, right? You see the copper wire from the, I guess, atomic level. but then you see an actual copper wire and how that works. So right there, kids are able to connect what they were seeing there to what they're seeing in front of them, which is just a big, important thinking in levels sort of thing. It's really hard to get to that one a lot of the time. But, it doesn't even need to be, like, I'm a biologist, so, you talk about, on the same day, talking about a cell and what tissue is made from those cells, and then what organ. So in a single day, instead of talking about like the heart, and then another day talking about, we know the heart does this is how it contracts in the tissue. Talking about all of those in the same day and how they interact is just a great computational thinking thing. Tough thing to say. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so, okay, so this is a leaf electroscope, what we see here, and really what's happening is that we've got a charge differential, right, and it actually, in order to balance it out, it starts borrowing electrons and it pushes those two leaves apart. This is something, again, you can make these if you wanted to, but you'll notice it's not like super dramatic. You have to be patient and so forth. The pith ball, it's a little bit easier to see the static electricity. So the pith ball electroscope looks like this. Now, when we did this the first time in our Stellar Girls training, there were a few things that make it a little bit easier or harder to use. The pith ball itself, when you make it, it works better if the pith ball is relatively small. Okay, it needs to be relatively small. It also, the way in which this is put together, you're going to be shoving a straw through a cup. And it is helpful to have bending straws just because I think it's a little easier for them to manipulate. And you need to have thread available. The thread, and it does need to be thread rather than string, just because of the size of the pith ball particularly. But this is how the directions for making this are here. I have found, Carol, do you think it has to be taped down?
I think it works, but if you can pick it up and do things with it.
Right, I think it's easier, or depending on what you're gonna actually end up doing with the pith ball or with the electroscope, if it's not taped down, but you do need to have an aluminum pan. There are aluminum pans up here, there are cups up here, straws. You need to follow the direction and make your, I found it easier when I put this together to just hang, make sure that the straw is in there already. To tie the string on with the pith ball, they don't want to use too big a piece of string because that gets distracting, and they definitely want to trim it all up when they're done. But if they tie it nice and tight, and that again is a challenge for them, if they tie it nice and tight, then they can alter the length simply by rolling their straw. So they don't have to worry so much about getting it tied in the right spot, which is always a problem. If it's not super tight, if they just put a little piece of string on there, or not string, I'm sorry, tape on there, then they can get the same effect. But then they can alter it. And that also adds another layer of variable to the experimentation if you want to play around with it a lot. But I'm going to ask you guys to make one, and then once you've made one, then I'm going to put some experimenting up there. So let's aim for 10 minutes. All right, 10 minutes. And the example is up here, directions, and example. Oh, yeah.
The styrofoam cup and the straw.
Oh, the thread is over here. It's probably. Okay, I got a tool of thread over here. And let me grab one. You can just cut off.
I started
Yeah. Oh, no. I'm sure it's not. There are also scissors over here. So if you, because you are going to trim your thread, so.
They seem like they don't. He would never make it out. He made it. He had nothing. His kids over here. Oh, wow.
Alright, that's right. That's great. Okay, well, I'll be there. Make a bowl. Make a bowl. I'll make that.
Good, how are you? Yeah, so I'm glad to be back up.
Oh, yeah,
You're not even and back off, I can transfer everything.
Stay away from it. It was not I really enjoyed
Now, all the bias stuff, we're gonna go through
As you guys are trying to punch holes in your styrofoam cup, it actually works best to use your pencil to make a hole, and then try and shove your straw through, rather than using the straw to create the hole. And you guys, if you have, once you finish that or you're working with a partner, if you have your balloon, you do want your balloon to be blown up. So yes, we saved some of the balloons. Some are over on the side. Yep, there's some over here. And if your balloon is destroyed, we have some extra balloons in case you need it.
This is gonna be something I I pay all one every second. That's the other problem with your egg.
Yes, there's two, I'm sorry, right on the counter right here. Guys, if you feel like you need some tape, the transparent tape is right here, so feel free to just grab it and try what you need to. You can use foam plate too. Foam plate is over here, so if you would like to do that, sure, you can do that as well. I'd like to try that, because they both work. Okay. All right, so once you have your electroscope made, the next thing to do there are actually two different ways to use this electroscope. One of them is just to play around with the pitfall. Now, just so that you know this and you can share this with your girls, this was one of the early ways that they used to find a way of measuring an amount of static electricity. And they measured it in terms of the attraction of the pitfall. So to see that just the basic idea behind the pitfall, you can use the balloon, you can use the foam plate. I've got a couple of glass rods. You can use the rubber rod, but you want to build up a static charge and then bring it up to the pitfall and watch what happens. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay,
Okay. Now, there are all kinds of different ways that you can do this with your girls if you want to spend a lot of time on it. It is actually part one there are two parts to this lesson. So you want to think about how much time you want to spend. For our program, we have 2 hours. We're from 4 to 6. So we add as much stuff in there as we possibly can. We would probably have the girls try each one of them, report out what you see with this, what you see, and this particular electroscope is just like with the foil leaves. It requires some patience. It doesn't always work the way you want it to. You're not always building up the same charge on the balloons. You're not always building up the same charge on the rods. It's just, it's very, very low.
So the free petals.
Yes.
The other stuff is attracting.
Exactly. Why would that be? Why would it be? Has anyone else? Yeah. Has anyone else tried it with the styrofoam plates? Try it with this. Come up and grab a styrofoam plate so that you can see the difference.
Okay. Really cool. So what did you do that thing for?
Retracted it.
Okay.
So
Oh. They just went after you.
Well, I have been rubbing stuff all over, so it's probably just a mess of charges. Okay, now the reason why the electroscope is actually on the metal pan, and for this, because of the type of aluminum pan that we have, I've actually bent the side here because really what you want to do is you want to have the pitfall suspended so that it is close to the metal pan but not touching the metal pan, because as soon as it touches, it's going to discharge. That you should be able to show the electricity passing through this aluminum pan and affecting the pitfall. I personally have never ever gotten this to work, ever. Yeah, I can't get it to work, but I know that it's possible. You cannot be holding the pan when you do it, because as soon as you do that, you discharge into yourself. These tables are great because they don't absorb any charge, but depending on what surface you're working on, the surface can cause a problem. But you want to make sure that you're touching the pan, and then they should also be able to see that if I put the charge here, it travels to the ball. I've never, you got that to work? Yeah, I have never gotten into it, so. So you never got one. I've never ever gotten it to work.
To deactivate.
If I charge up the balloon, touch it to the aluminum pan and it should travel. That's why I'm touching the pan. I have never, ever.
And you girls haven't when they've done it, okay? Interesting.
I think we just don't build up enough charge to make a large enough.
But it'll grab the ball.
Oh, okay, yeah. Cool.
You can't build up enough static electricity. Sounds like a great way to get some kids into it.
Yeah, true.
Kids are gonna leave in bald spots.
Where's it because we're getting.
So she wants it close but not touch it, right?
Yes.
That's too far.
That's
It's not reliable.
and then like
It bounced a little bit, but I can't tell if it's just because like it's like bouncing back and forth or.
Oh, I heard it. Yeah.
For the record. Yeah, I thought it did too, but I'm like, I'm that's how it's just working. I thought the first time. I thought so too, but then I was like, I don't trust it.
That works really good with
Let it go.
Yeah, this one works really good. So,
Just getting some charge here, activating the electrons.
In the interest of time, just because I want to make sure that we can get to too. Obviously, there's a lot of exploration that you can do with this, and we would talk about it and write down what we've seen, and a little bit about how this relates to this picking up the pressure of balloons. We got all kinds of static stuff going on, but they do the same thing. They're going to explore. They're going to think it's cool. They're going to try and shock each other. Those kinds of things. But helping them to understand what static electricity is. It is not the electricity that's coming through and lighting up the lights. So you guys need to realize that as well. It is not that electricity. It is a buildup of charge where you've got a charge differential, one charge on one thing, one charge on another, that when those two things come together have to equalize. That's what static is.
and if you think about static, static is, like motionless, it's still. And that's what static electricity is, where regular current is.
Right, the only time it ever travels is if the two of them come close enough to discharge. That is the only time. So it is not moving electricity. However, it is electricity that can be harnessed and turned into moving electricity, which is the whole point to the battery. But you can talk about what's happening with the pit ball, right? It's the same thing that we saw in the other activities where we build up charge and then it attracts the charges on the pit ball because the pit ball's is a conductor and has both, and everything kind of orients to one side and pulls it all over. So that's really what's happening. So they all kind of orient themselves and pull over. And then we see the pit ball move, right? But I want you to remember that when a conductor atom is next to another conductor atom and an electron jumps, it is going to jump into that next valence shell for the next atom. And that's going to create current. But it needs to happen in an orderly fashion in order to conduct current. So what we can do is we can put it in a battery. So remember, we talked about Ben's battery. This is a very simple, the word is escaping me. What do we call that? No, there's a name for it that you guys would know. It'll come to me. But it basically, thank you, capacitor. It is a capacitor. And what we have going on is that when the electricity goes down and touches this pin, it travels down, there's a chain down here, and we create a differential that we can then harness. So batteries work using that differential. That's why we have a positive end and a negative end. So we're gonna watch this little video because it explains it way better than I would be able to.
What are batteries? Can you imagine a world where all electrical appliances have to be plugged in? Flashlights, cell phones, and toys would be tethered to electrical outlets, making them clumsy and inconvenient. Batteries provide portable, convenient sources of energy for powering devices without wires or cables. A dry cell is a common type of battery used today. It basically converts stored chemical energy into electrical energy. In the most basic terms, a battery cell is made up of three components: an anode, a cathode, and the electrolyte. In the dry cell, zinc is the anode, the graphite core is the cathode, and ammonium chloride paste acts as an electrolyte. Due to a chemical reaction within the battery, the anode builds up an excess of electrons. This causes an electrical difference between the anode and the cathode. The electrons want to rearrange themselves and displace the extra electrons in the cathode. However, the electrolyte ensures that the electrons cannot travel directly to the cathode. When the circuit is closed with the help of a conductive path between the anode and cathode, the electrons are able to travel to the cathode. This in turn provides power to any appliance placed along the way. Over time, this electrochemical process alters the chemical makeup in the anode and cathode, and eventually they stop providing electrons. And this is how a battery dies. Batteries provide us with a mobile source of power that makes many modern conveniences possible.
Right? So we're talking about things that can either absorb electrons or are going to give off electrons. Now, to set this up, basically, we create something called a voltaic pile. This is what the early battery looked like, and you can see how these things are stacked. So this is basically what it looks like. And what we have is we have an anode and a cathode separated by electrolytes. Okay, and because they're touching another anode or cathode, it actually changes or allows for a buildup in strength. So we have two electrodes that are two metals that we're going to use. One is going to give off free electrons. That's going to be zinc. We're going to be using nickels because nickels are not made out of nickel anymore. They're made out of zinc. So we're going to use that as our source of electrons. And then we're going to use copper. We're going to use pennies. And the pennies are going to be our cathode. And we're going to create an electrolyte. Now, this is in the instructions, how you can make the electrolyte. You can have your girls do the electrolyte if you want to, but there's not really any reason to do that. But the electrolyte is basically just vinegar and salt. That's all it is. So we have a vinegar and salt solution here along with some cups. Nobody needs a lot of this. Just like covering the bottom is going to be plenty. You're also going to need some soapy water because the soapy water is actually going to clean off the surface of the pennies and nickels so that the metal is not coated with oils and things that are generally on our hands when we're using coins. So what we're going to actually be doing is we're going to be creating an electrical potential called voltage. Now, voltage is the force that causes the electrons to flow and move from one area to the other. It's an easy thing to measure. But to measure it, we need to measure with a multimeter. We're not going to measure current here. We're going to measure the voltage because that's the simplest. Is it not in there?
Can you refresh? I've edited the slide.
Maybe.
But maybe you're not in that good.
Let's try refreshing. Maybe. There we go. seeing it, Carol.
Oh, that's weird.
Well, it's all right. So basically what you guys are going to be doing is you are going to be setting up a battery. Now, as you do this, we are going to want to make sure that you guys can measure to see how effective your battery is. In a multimeter, go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, the multimeters we have, they're mostly all set up for you, but the red and the blue, the black wires go in like this. We can use an example. I have a slide, but you want to turn it on. Some of them I noticed aren't working, so make sure that shit goes on. The batteries might be dead, but find one that works. Turn it. Go to the DCV side and go to 20, and that's going to set you in the right range. And then all you do is attach your two ends to your object, and it'll read voltage for you.
All right, now, in order that you kind of know, and this is something that is not written in the instructions, but helps to kind of mindset the girls so that they understand. We have AA batteries here. AA batteries are 1.5 volts. So if they take the multimeter and set it up and touch both ends so that they create a current flow, they should get 1.5, either a little higher or a little lower, depending on the health of the battery. And then they will know, number one, that they're on the right, that they have it set up correctly. So what we're gonna do is all of the materials are here. I can't remember why. Oh, we're not using a plastic sheet. We're gonna be using. So these are the things that you need. These are the materials, so like the salt and vinegar, that's our electrolyte, and you're gonna use the cups. The dish soap, you're gonna be using the cups. I think it helps to have forceps to move the paper. Everyone's gonna need, it's kind of open because you wanna be able to come up and get some, but I think probably 3 is probably all you need to start. And the same thing with the pennies and nickels, 3 of each is probably a good place to start. And we have to start with a neutral base, so we are going to be using the small plastic plates, okay? And what else do you need? You won't need scissors because we cut the paper for you already, so that's not an issue. And as soon as you pick that stuff up, I will put the instructions up, but the full instructions are on the paper. The abridged instructions will be up here. Okay, and once you create your first voltaic pile with an anode and a cathode and electrolyte in between, which is going to be soaked in your paper towel, so you're going to put it in there. Once you have your first one, then you want to measure it with the multimeter, right? Touch your anode, touch your cathode, and see how much voltage you actually have generated. Does that make sense? All right, so pick up your stuff and then Did you see that? Scissors are right up there, but don't give me that. Paper towel. It held enough here. Roll it all around. Yes, but it took a while. It took a while. Maybe I turned it. Yep. Maybe.
I'll just help you. Okay. Got this.
Oh, yeah, sorry about that now, but, well, I'm just
Those are working.
Give me that one, good.
Alright, get paper plates.
And I have the paper towel, a little one.
Vinegar.
Oh, I did.
How much salt and much vinegar?
It's already mixed.
I don't know what it is.
Oh, I think
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
And a paper plate.
And it's a paper house pour up, right?
That was
Yeah, it's just paper towels cut into little strips.
Okay.
Next December.
Yes.
Yeah, so you have to do 2 components in one.
Well, there were 3 components, right?
There's 4.
Well, we already had 1. Oh, we already had 1. Yes. I mean, they finished more than a year.
No, they only allow-
But we do like, you have.
I just don't have a little meter thing.
Or in the fall.
The plate is plastic.
And then,
We're guessing.
Probably. Right, you're well. Well, that's how
I broke that one, so I gotta try again. At first you don't succeed, try again.
Our plastic sheet is our plastic plates.
Be this big. Alright,
And
got everything
to
ready?
fold it into strips basically means like you're folding it like this.
Right. Folding it into a strip.
Okay, there are extra paper towels up here because you are gonna wanna dry your pennies and your nickel.
3 equal sections and pull the side. Yep. About equal as this.
Exact size?
Yeah, because you're gonna.
Well, we need 4. Oh, we need 4. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I have 4.
What paper are we soaking in solution? Soaking in solution?
Yeah, put the pennies and nickels in your salt, or your water, sorry, your soap.
And the soap and water
And the
first,
soap,
clean them
yeah,
out.
Yeah, the soap and water first.
Okay. Does everybody else kind of understand what these pennies are made of? They won't be as much.
Like soak one of those and let till it's
Oh, yeah. So as you guys are working with those little pieces of paper towel, having forceps is helpful to like pick it up. And I am almost, yes, you do not want the paper to like droop down and touch the coin below it, right? You don't want, because if it, which is not a big deal on the first stack, but on the second stack, if it goes down, it's gonna short circuit it. because it'll have another route to travel. Yep.
I'll make it
milliamps not. And then if you have something like higher than milliamps, you can take this out and change that. Right here.
So that.
All right, so you do your
It's not bad, that's a lot more stuff too.
Yeah.
And actually,
even not one is one you have to do it, fold it so it's not touching the foil. No, so this is fine, but this guy right here, this should not be, that should go on the bottom, so it should look like this. And then. Yep. Okay, so that's this guy. I don't know why either. It's the aluminum strip in both the plate.
So ignore this, but I'm gonna cross this out.
I would. It's not. So this little guy right here has to go on top of this, and then the nickel on top of that. I'm gonna say they're maybe a little bit big. That might be just a little bit big, so I might. Yeah, we don't want it to fall on the ones that can be. So no, this is good right there. And then you want to dry a nickel and put a nickel on top.
Right. One microvolt.
another piece of not a lot.
So as you guys are measuring with the multimeter, remember that it's on a piece of aluminum foil which is conductive. So you can, with your multimeter, touch the top of the, what's on top, the nickel, and then touch the foil, and you should be able to measure your voltage.
Oh!
Alright.
So in theory, 0.5, and that should be at 1.
Question mark.
So we should have written down every level.
Yeah, like what's the relationship?
Change it
aren't there.
Yeah.
How's it going? Is everybody getting voltage that they can measure? Okay, so this is not a difficult thing to do, right? And there's lots of good vocabulary. There's anode and cathode, and if you wanted to, you could actually front end this by making a little diagram of a battery. They could like piece it together, whatever you want to do to, especially in the lower grades, it helps to model it a little bit. You can draw arrows on that diagram to show where the electrons are moving, very similar to what they did in the video. Because for the younger girls, I don't know how accessible that video is, how well they might understand that. But you could do the very same thing by like creating that, showing the little electrons, and actually you could use like little dot stickers and have them move the stickers along or something like that, so that they kind of understand what the battery's actually doing. Now, we, again, both of these activities, the electroscope and the battery, are both part of the same lesson, right? Those are both part of the same thing. So you have to decide how you want to do this. But what we did in our group when we got done, because actually building the battery doesn't really take very long. However, what we then did, and in our group, I don't think we ever got past number of stacked units. Oh, actually, that's not true. We did number of stacked units, and we gathered data. So each group gathered the data. How much voltage did you get? How much voltage, did you get when you had 2 stacks, and so forth. You could have them graph that if you so wanted to do that. You could have them average the data from everybody and add the math in there. We also we happen to have 2 different kinds of paper towel in this room. We've got the lovely stuff that you get at the grocery store and the industrial stuff that doesn't hardly holds anything. So we compared the 2 of those and how does that change the voltage. The girls could come up with other things that they might want to do. They could try and change coins and see what happens. So there are lots of things that they can do to kind of experiment with that. But that's basically how this goes. And if you look at it, I know that the materials list is intimidating looking. Think about when you decide to do this, think about going to the PowerPoint and looking at what is actually being used. It helps to kind of move things along if you have some things prepared already, but you could also have them like make their own. They can cut their own squares. That could also be a variable, what happens. So these are all things you can do. We happen to do this in 2 lessons. We split this into 2 sessions. And we also spent the time doing the batteries out of fruits. We did lemons, we got oranges, we took bananas, we did pickles, we did, these are the instructions, but I also loaded into the folder a PDF for you that has that's a simple lab, but I also have paper copies for you if you would like to take one of those. On the citrus battery, just so that you know, citrus batteries are like electroscopes. Depending on how they put it together, how they fold things, how they touched things, and so forth. Sometimes their batteries work really well, sometimes they don't. And again, sometimes they, especially after doing the coins, they realize that they can actually create a stack in the fruit, with multiple coins and paper clips and so forth. But it was fun to do. I think we did tomatoes too. I can't remember. We did a whole bunch of them. And they had a great time playing around with it. It was a really nice reinforcement for what we had done with anode and cathode. So that is also an option. And there is a little explanation over here about why it works or doesn't work. And there is, at the very end, there are a bunch of different resources for you. So, you know, you can play around with it. But that's kind of the structure of this lesson. Anybody have any questions? Okay, so we have lunch here in the room next door. But before we do that, just because we're gonna start moving new things on our tables, I'm gonna ask you guys to return the materials back to where you got them. The electrolyte and soap can just go in the drain and you can stack the cups. But then you can go through that set of double doors to the room next door and lunch is in there. I'll bring this little over here. Yeah, please do. I figured you won't use it. No, I'm not gonna need that. Yeah, guys, feel free to keep your electroscopes. Just so that you remember, sometimes that helps. Or take a picture of it so that you know exactly what it looks like.
Right.
Can you pour?
Yeah, right side, right in front.
Like, okay.
Yeah, we had a plan before.
Yes, these are my, I have
For beginning,
these are
so maybe
they are, they work for so many things.
Or